Welcome to today's webinar on wireless LAN security concerns. As you may know, here at CWNP, we will be releasing a new version of the CWSP exam, which will also include a new study guide, a new course, and so forth. Well, in preparation for that, we're moving forward by studying some specific areas related to wireless LAN security in webinars over the next 3 months, and this is the first in that series. So today we want to talk about what are the security concerns related to wireless LANs? And we'll talk about network discovery, pseudo-security solutions, things that people often think are giving them security, but they are not, legacy security mechanisms, and network attacks. Now, before we get into the content of today's presentation, I do want to point out that due to some technical challenges, we'll not be doing any Q&A today. However, you can always utilize our forums at cwnp.com to ask questions you might have about wireless LAN security concerns. And do please feel free to chat with each other in the chat here as the webinar is going on. Also, you'll be able to watch the archive of this webinar at YouTube at a later time at the CWNP TV YouTube channel. So now the first topic we want to talk about today is the discovery process, which can work in one of two ways. It can either be passive discovery or it can be active discovery. Discovery is the process used by wireless clients to locate the wireless local area network, or the wireless LAN. And so a wireless client will look for a network to join based on an SSID. This process is known as discovery. When it's passive, it simply means that the client is looking for beacon frames that match the criteria that that client is looking for. So for example, if a client wants to connect to a network named West 4309, it will look for beacon frames from an access point indicating that the network it provides is West 4309. And then it will attempt to connect to that network once it has discovered it. So passive discovery is simply looking at beacon frames coming from the access point in an infrastructure basic service set in order to connect to that network. The other method of discovery is active discovery. In active discovery or active scanning, the discovery process uses probe request management frames, which are sent by the client devices, and a probe response management frame, which would be sent by the access point as part of this discovery process. So the client stations will send a probe request, and all APs that hear it and support the SSID requested by the client will respond with a probe response. The client station can use those probe response frames and the signal strength of those frames and so on in order to decide which access point to which it wishes to connect. So the client station sends the probe request to the AP responds with a probe response frame. In that probe response frame, not only will it say, yes, I know that SSID, but it will also communicate to the client station the security features it requires, such as WPA or WPA2, and any other parameters like data rates that it supports and things like that. Probe response frames, in fact, are nearly identical to beacon frames, except that the AID and TIM information is not included. So this is active scanning. Now, an attacker needs to discover a network if it wants to attempt to gain access to that network, and therefore it needs discovery hardware. Well, typically a laptop can be used as discovery hardware, right? If you think about it, it's a common station that you might use to connect to the network. And so therefore, that very laptop could be used for discovery of wireless LANs. Now, you could also use a tablet with just the built-in software to find wireless networks, or you could use a tablet that has support for specialty software. For example, we see here a screenshot of a Dell Windows 8 tablet that is using the MetaGeek Wi-Spy DBX adapter in order to locate wireless networks based on RF signals and not just necessarily beacon frames or probe request and response frames. And so we can use this type of device. And then we have custom-built spectrum analyzers that could be utilized. And we also have Wi-Fi Finder devices. Now, many of these Wi-Fi Finder devices are older and they only support 11G or possibly 11A, but you can find a few of them that support newer systems. But the interesting thing is, if you are dealing with 2.4 gigahertz, even an 11N network can be discovered by these older 11G Wi-Fi finders. It just sees it as an 11G network when it locates it. In addition to discovery hardware, an attacker may choose to use discovery software to find your network. This could be just the built-in wireless configuration software of the operating system or the client utilities, Or it could be that they use something more advanced like a protocol analyzer like Wireshark in order to capture beacon frames and probe request and probe response frames. And they could use something like Insider from MetaGeek to locate networks, signal strength information about those networks, find out what channels they're on, what security they're utilizing, and things like that. In addition to Insider, you do also have other tools like Xeris Wi-Fi Inspector and so on, but these are discovery software applications that help you find the network. The point of all of this is that the first step that an attacker needs to use to gain access to a wireless LAN to which they are not authorized to access is to locate that wireless LAN. And discovery hardware and software and discovery processes are what they used. Now, before we get into some of the additional specific security concerns of wireless networks, I want to talk to you about this concept of the weakest link. The security of a wireless network is really only as strong as the weakest link. In other words, if legacy security solutions such as WEP are in place, you can consider that the best you really have because a client can connect with WEP. So for example, if you have 50 devices that are connected to the wireless network and 49 of those devices use the strongest security available, like WPA2, right? And one device is using WEP, the security has potentially been diminished by WEP. And that's the big key here. So maybe you've got strong encryption, you've got strong authentication, yet somewhere you're using a weak link. And so this weak link is what we call pseudo-security in our training. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the pseudo-security solutions, things that you often hear provide security for a wireless LAN, but they actually do not provide security, at least not against a real attacker. The first one of the most common, hiding the SSID. You'll see this in a lot of vendor literature still today. They'll say, if you want your network to be harder to discover, go ahead and hide the SSID. Well, it's true that it is harder to discover, but it's not true that it really gives you security against an attacker. Attackers know that you can get around SSID hiding easily. Yes, if you disable the broadcasting of the SSID on the access point, it does make it such that the SSID is no longer in the beacon frame. Instead, there's just a null value. It's a null SSID in the beacon frame. But the question is, will that SSID be located anywhere else? Well, the answer is yes. In addition to beacon management frames, you also have probe request and probe response frames, association request and reassociation request frames. These will always contain the SSID. So even if you remove it from the beacon management frame, it doesn't take long to see some other frame that actually has the SSID in it. So an attacker using a protocol analyzer or specialty software that simply looks in these other frames in order to find the SSIDs that are available can locate that SSID. Now, one of the things that we deal with then is the broadcast SSID in probe requests. So the IEEE 802.11/2012 standard does define a broadcast SSID as a wildcard or blank SSID. The standard requires access points to respond to all probe requests that contain a matching SSID or this blank or broadcast SSID. Most manufacturers provide the configuration option to prevent access points from responding to probe request frames, even though the standard requires it. The Wi-Fi Alliance doesn't deny certification to manufacturers who disable broadcast SSID responses. So it's important to know that the standard does require the response, but the Wi-Fi Alliance is allowing vendors to slip things through that do not respond to those broadcast probe requests. And here in this screenshot from One Management Interface, we see the checkbox available to ignore broadcast probe requests. Okay, another pseudo-security solution is MAC address filtering. Now this one really feels like security when you do it. It feels like security because it's so hard to do, especially in a large environment. In a small environment, say your home where you've got 5 or 6 clients that connect, it's easy enough to go through and do MAC address filtering. But in a large environment where you have hundreds or maybe thousands of clients that connect, it's very hard. The concept of MAC address filtering is to simply say, okay, every wireless client adapter has a MAC address associated with it. So we're only going to allow the MAC addresses onto our network that we have pre-approved to get onto our network. And therefore we need a MAC address table. This would be the list of MAC addresses that are allowed to be on the network. Well, the problem is that while you can set up the list of MAC addresses that are allowed to get on the network, or that are specifically denied access to the network in many cases, you can also find valid MAC addresses. How would you find a valid MAC address? Well, all you have to do is sniff for packet captures that contain communications from a client to the AP of data frames and these kinds of things, because you're going to see the source MAC address. And guess what? That source MAC address is a valid MAC address that can definitely communicate on the network. So now all you need to do is use that MAC address. This is called spoofing MAC addresses. When you're spoofing MAC addresses, what you're doing is you're discovering the MAC address and other details of your client adapter. Once you have that MAC address, you then go in and you configure it to use an address that's valid on the network. So on a Mac or Linux, you can just use the ifconfig command to set your MAC address. On Windows, you can use SMAC. Nmap will allow you to spoof a MAC address, and there are other tools as well. Some driver interfaces in Windows allow you within the device manager to actually set the MAC address. So these are all different ways that you could spoof a MAC address. Therefore, MAC address filtering does not give you security against an attacker. Someone who has some skill, in other words. Now, would SSID hiding and MAC address filtering make it harder to gain access to your network? Yes, it definitely does make it harder to gain access to your network, but it's not really something we can place in the category of secure networking. Because when we talk about secure networking, what are we trying to protect against? Not usually accidental access. We're trying to protect against intentional access. And that's usually an attacker who knows how to use these tools to get around our quote unquote security. Therefore, we call it pseudo-security, or wannabe security, or not really security. Very important to keep in mind. MAC address filtering, SSID hiding, it's not going to give you security. Now, you might use it for some kind of management function, for some type of administrative function. There might be some reason you come up with to use either or both of these, but please do not think it's giving you some kind of effective security in your environment. Okay, now I'm going to shock you for a moment. Open system authentication today is the authentication on which all true security is based. Wow, that sounds odd. Open system authentication is the authentication on which all true, and I should say 802.11 security is based. What do I mean by that? Well, we're going to do open system authentication, and then we're going to do WPA or WPA2. And so we're not just going to do open system authentication, but we'll do it first, and then we'll do the authentication process that's really going to give us strong authentication. Open system authentication, or OSA, is itself null authentication. Basically, an authentication request is sent to the AP, and the AP says, okay, sure, you can get on. So we request to get on, the AP says you are on. So open system authentication is the first step after network discovery, and it doesn't give you secure authentication at all. It really just gets you connected to the access point so that you can effectively authenticate. Now, when we talk about authentication, sometimes WEP is called authentication. Well, WEP is still in the standard. You can still see WEP referenced in 802.11 2012. For example, clause 11.2.2.1 says WEP 40 was defined as a means of protecting, using a 40-bit key, the confidentiality of data exchanged among authorized users of a wireless LAN from casual eavesdropping. Implementation of WEP is optional. The same algorithms have been widely used with a 104-bit key instead of a 40-bit key in installed implementations. This is called WEP 104. The WEP cryptographic encapsulation and decapsulation mechanics are the same whether a 40-bit or 140-bit key is used. Therefore, subsequently, WEP can refer to either WEP 40 or WEP 104. So that's a statement from 802.11 2012. It's not recommended, but it is an optional thing to still be implemented. It should not be installed or used in any modern network. So if you're building a network today, certainly you would not want to use WEP. Now, we could talk about all of the weaknesses of WEP. We could talk about a poor implementation of RC4. We could talk about a small initialization vector pool. We could talk about bad integrity checks. There are all kinds of things we could talk about that are weaknesses of WEP. But it's best just to say, don't use it. That's really where we are with WEP today. Nothing more needs to be said. Don't use it. Now, you might say, but wait, what if I'm in a situation where I just have to use it? Well, the answer to that would be you have to use it, right? So if you have to use it, you have to use it. But obviously, we're saying don't ever choose to use it. It is very rare these days that you run into a situation where you would truly say you have to use WEP. And even if you did use WEP, you'd probably want to implement something else over it, like a VPN or something like that, if you have true need for security of your data on that communication link. So get away from WEP and instead use WPA or WPA2, preferably WPA2. Now, one of the attack methods is simply eavesdropping on our wireless LANs. Eavesdropping on the wireless LAN simply means we're listening in on a conversation, right? So we're getting IP information, but possibly even layer 7 information, actual application data like email addresses and so forth. Effective protocol analyzers these days can actually reassemble data for you. So for example, they can reassemble a voice over IP conversation and play back the audio for you. So eavesdropping allows unintended recipients to view and possibly exploit unencrypted wireless traffic. Now, if you wanted to eavesdrop on WEP encrypted traffic, the first thing you would do is hack the WEP key. Once you've hacked the WEP key, you can put it in your protocol analyzer, and then it can decrypt the data for you on the fly. If you know the WPA or WPA2 pre-shared key, you could also decrypt that on the fly. When it comes to WPA and WPA2 enterprise, because of the way keys are derived, it's a very different and challenging situation for eavesdropping. But still, eavesdropping on authentication processes and things like that may reveal information that makes the network susceptible to some kinds of attack. So eavesdropping, listening in on communications, this is done with a protocol analyzer. Now here's an attack method that applies to every area of security, and that's social engineering. So we talked about the weakest link, right? Maybe you've got great encryption, good authentication, solid policies, effective monitoring, and access control, but your users are still your weakest link. Social engineering has often been called one of the most effective tools in the hacker's toolbox. Now, there are different kinds of social engineering. We'll not go into all of the details of all of them today, but the concept of social engineering in general is that you're manipulating the human communications process to get humans, people, to give you information they should not give you, and therefore potentially give you access to the network. So, for example, you might do something like baiting, where you are luring in the person with something they'd really like to have, and you get information from them to do it. One of the old examples I like to utilize is saying that you call up somebody and say, hey, we've got a printer that you have won. It's a network printer, and because it's complex to configure, we want to send it pre-configured for your network. You won this from that conference you were at a while back. Remember you entered that raffle? Oh, no, not really. Well, no matter. You did, and you have won, so we're going to ship this to you. Are you still at the following address? And all I'm doing is giving you some address I pulled from a website. Okay, great. Well, what I need to do to configure this is I need you to give me a valid IP address that's available on your network. You see, I'm attacking someone in the IT group, right? So they give me an IP address, and before you know it, I've got configuration information. Now, you'd think, well, no one would give you any of that information. Well, actually, they do quite easily and quite often. Social engineering really does work, and it's a powerful tool for gathering information that can help attackers gain access to your networking. Another thing that falls into social engineering listed here is dumpster diving, which simply means that we're literally going through the trash. In the trash, you might find things like network diagrams, a piece of paper where someone wrote the WPA pre-shared key, right? WPA2 pre-shared key. And now that I've got it, I can gain access to the network. So these are all different attack methods that are used with social engineering. And you can look up any of these terms online: pretexting, phishing, quid pro quo, baiting, phone phishing, or it's sometimes called IVR, interactive voice response, dumpster diving, and so on. And you can find more information about these. Then we have the RF denial of service, or DOS. In this case, RF energy is intentionally generated in a particular frequency range that will interfere with the network. So it could be custom software and network adapters that allow you to do it. You could actually have a signal generator that you use for it. You could use a cordless phone or a baby monitor to intentionally create it, or it might be unintentional with these kinds of devices. Wireless cameras, they're very popular in 2.4 gigahertz, but we're seeing them in 5 gigahertz too, folks. So I know right now there's plenty of space in 5 gigahertz, and we love that, but 802.11 is not the only thing that's saying, let me go to 5 gigahertz. I have, for example, in my possession, something that I use fairly frequently in presentations at conference centers and so forth, and that is 5 gigahertz wireless video. So it's HDMI. You plug HDMI into both of these devices, and then it creates a 5 gigahertz wireless link between them. And let me tell you something, when you're running a video stream across this link, it consumes about the equivalence of an 80 megahertz channel in 5 gigahertz Uni 3 in most cases is what it chooses to use. And you can just forget it. Anything that wanted to work in that range is done, because this thing is super high utilization, flooding that range. And it's 5 gigahertz. So that's just one example of something within the 802.11 5 gigahertz area. And we'll continue to see more and more of these. But thankfully for right now, 5 gigahertz is more open than 2.4 gigahertz, and we have less accidental problems there. Certainly microwave ovens aren't going to be in 5 gigahertz. We see them in 2.4 gigahertz, and some of them can be much more severe than others. But these all can cause either severe or incidental denial of services effectively against the RF layer. Now, in addition, there are layer 2 denial of service attacks. In this case, we're dealing with MAC flood types of attacks. Hijacking attacks could be denial of service. We could do TKIP MIC failure attacks, EAP floods, disassociation floods, probe response floods. All of these are staying down there at layer 2, the MAC layer, right? Part of the data link layer. So they're staying down there at layer 2. But if you can flood layer 2, effectively it's as damaging in many cases as an RF DOS, or at least as many incidental RF DOS attacks can be. So this is a very severe denial of service attack that can be launched against your network too. This is a security concern. And then we have peer-to-peer attacks. In this case, the concern is a peer attacking another peer. This is certainly a common concern at public hotspots. But peer-to-peer attacks include just ad hoc attacks in ad hoc networks, where we actually can create an ad hoc connection because a laptop is accidentally configured to continually be starting an ad hoc network, and therefore another device can connect to it and then steal data or communicate with the device. Hijacking, man-in-the-middle attacks. We'll talk more about man-in-the-middle in a moment. Layer 2 denial of service attacks, data theft, infrared and Bluetooth could be used for connections in some cases, depending on what services are open. Basically, what we could do is we could do peer-to-peer traffic blocking in some cases to help prevent these. That's a feature to configure on the access point, but it does depend on the configuration of the client and what that client is listening for and attempting to do as well. Now, the next kind of attack or wireless security concern is a man-in-the-middle attack. Man-in-the-middle attack is a concern because, in this case, it's taking eavesdropping to a whole other level. With a man-in-the-middle attack, the way it works is we cause a station to become disassociated from the valid AP, and we actually have a fake AP that it's now going to connect to because it has a stronger signal. In most cases, it'll connect to me. And I may still let that client use the network as it normally does, but all of its communications are going through me. And so I have the ability to eavesdrop on it or even manipulate the communications and change them in some way to cause the actions that are being requested to be different. So the process of a man-in-the-middle attack is to eavesdrop and configure your soft AP to mimic the appropriate parameters of the legitimate AP. We then hijack the client connection. How do we do that? Well, we do it by sending a disassociation frame, some type of an RF DOS attack, anything to force that client station to disconnect from its current AP and then connect to me, because I may be at a laptop that's 10 feet away, whereas the AP was 70 feet away. And so I have the stronger signal. It prefers me on the next connection and connects. And then I continue to provide network connectivity to the client, and I exploit their wireless traffic to the LAN or probe and exploit the client device directly and do a kind of a peer-to-peer attack. So these are man-in-the-middle attacks, and they can definitely be serious problems for sensitive data. Now, the next type of attack would be attacks against management interfaces. And these will always be with us because it has to do with really configuration. So management interface issues have to do with the fact that our devices need to be configured, first of all, differently from their default. So we don't want to have default configurations. It's very common for consumer wireless routers and even small business wireless devices to be configured and installed such that no default configuration settings are changed. This is a huge security concern because since no configuration settings are changed, it means that I can get into that device and just use a default logon password like, admin or admin with no password or something like that. And then I can get into the device, reconfigure it, give myself access to whatever I want, and gain access to your network. The other way to exploit management interfaces is when I have physical access. I may be able to plug into a console port or something like that that will give me access to the device. And if you forgot to secure that connection point, I can get in that way. Obviously, we need to change admin credentials. We need to use only strong management protocols. So we need to use SSH and HTTPS and not Telnet and HTTP. So we've got to be very careful about the protocols we're using when we connect to these devices. We've got to make sure that we're doing it in a secure way. And part of management interface exploit prevention, of course, is to make sure that you're staging your devices right, configuring them all offline, having a base configuration that makes sure all of these default configurations are changed, that everything is configured such that it should work effectively for you in a secure implementation. Now we'll talk about just a couple more things. One is authentication cracking. Authentication cracking really is trying to break things like shared key authentication, WPA, WPA2 personal, LEAP, EAP-MD5, PPTP, and of course legacy protocols can all be broken. They're all vulnerable. So we've got the list here. PAP, CHAP, MS-CHAP, MS-CHAP v2 used outside of secure tunnels. PPTP, probably more secure than some of the others listed here, but still has potential vulnerabilities. LEAP, again, potential vulnerabilities. EAP-MD5 is just very weak, and shared key authentication is very weak. So neither of these should be used at all, anywhere, any place. WPA and WPA2 personal, is it vulnerable? Well, it depends on how you have it set up. Obviously, it needs to be set up with a very strong pre-shared key. And if it's set up with a very strong pre-shared key, even using things like CalPatty and other more advanced and modern tools, you're still going to have a difficult time being able to break WPA, WPA2 with a strong key. If you have a 20-character key that is alphanumeric, then you're going to have a pretty strong key that is very, very hard to break with any of the modern cracking tools. But the basic process is to capture the four-way handshake. This is the actual process that is used with WPA or WPA2 to generate your encryption keys. Export that to a capture file, prepare a dictionary, and then you run the capture file against the dictionary to recover the password. So notice it's a dictionary attack, right? So if it's a dictionary attack, then obviously we're going to have some constraints. But we could build up rainbow tables. There are a lot of things you can do in order to make it go a whole lot faster. In our live classes, we talk in a little more detail about this process, and depending on where you take the training course, they may actually even walk you through the process of doing some WPA personal cracking. So when it comes to encryption cracking, we need to capture a sufficient amount of data and then get the encryption keys and exploit it. With WEP, it's pretty easy to do. DES is an older protocol as well. Some hash functions used within Wi-Fi are susceptible to this too. But do remember that you can do encryption cracking now very easily with tools that just come right in Kali Linux. It used to be called Backtrack. If you're not familiar with Kali, Kali is now what Backtrack used to be. So Kali.org, you can download virtual machines, run them in VMware, and get up and running in a heartbeat with all the software pre-installed that you need to do this encryption cracking as well as the authentication cracking that we talked about before. So a great way to do some testing and so forth. In a later webinar coming up later in this 3-part series on CWSP type topics, we'll be talking about using Kali Linux in a lab, because one of our webinars will be dealing on developing a lab for security education. So when you want to study for CWSP and you want a home lab, what would you put in that lab? We'll be talking about that in a later webinar. Now, there's some additional concerns to think about. We've got physical security. Obviously, our laptops are expensive, our client devices, tablets, our APs are very expensive. We don't want them stolen, and we don't want them modified or reconfigured in such a way that they cause a security concern. So there are some things we can do. We can lock them in the mounts, so we get mounts that are lockable rather than just the fact that anyone can walk up and slip it off the wall and walk away with our access point. We can get NEMA enclosures for outdoor devices. So there are certainly things that we can do in order to give us protection in these types of areas. But physical security is something we need to consider. Physical security should also be considered from the perspective of people being able to install rogue APs. So part of physical security then, in preventing the installation of rogue APs, is making sure that unused Ethernet ports are not just left open, but rather they're disabled until needed. So these would be ports in conference rooms, unused offices or cubicles, things like that, because anyone can walk up these days with an 802.11n pocket AP and plug it in and automatically have their own little wireless network to get onto your physical network if you haven't set that up appropriately. We also need to think about public access networks and security there. Public access wireless networks, which are usually called wireless hotspots, have a lot of potential vulnerabilities. This type of network can be a big draw for intruders. Many times a business like a restaurant or coffee shop might install a wireless AP for the convenience of its customers and to draw people into the business. In these kinds of scenarios, the infrastructure devices that are installed are often home or small office or SOHO devices, and they may not have enterprise security features. For that matter, they may not have any security features, and they may be configured to default, and it's amazing how often they are. So these vulnerabilities are a big problem, not just for the hotspot provider, but for their customers as well. Because of the way they're set up, they can potentially be subject to a variety of wireless network security threats like spam transmission, malware injection, information theft, peer-to-peer attacks, and various other internet attacks. So to protect in these environments, we might want to enable peer-to-peer blocking, have a good firewall configured, port blocking, protocol blocking, and have an intelligent intrusion prevention system that looks for behaviors that are signs of attack. Like, for example, is someone sending massive amounts of data instead of downloading it? Because at these hotspots, the norm is for most data to be downlink data. And if suddenly there's someone sending a lot of uplink data, that could be an issue. It's not necessarily. It could be that someone is uploading a file that they need to upload. So you need to at least get some kind of an alarm for that kind of thing. Someone could analyze it. But again, let's be real world. If it's a public access network at a coffee shop, do you really have someone on staff that's going to monitor that? I think we might get to the place in the future where we've got some good subscription services that can be reasonably priced enough that these kinds of hotspots may pay something like $15 or $20, that someone off in a data center somewhere is monitoring these alerts and looking at what it is being transferred. And maybe they see, well, this thing that's being transferred is in a VPN connection to what looks like a corporate office, so we're not as worried about it. Or this file being transferred is being sent up to Google Drive, and so we're not as worried about it. So there could be that kind of thing eventually, but for now, I think we're going to still see some potential vulnerabilities at public hotspots, but at least we can implement them in such a way to try to protect the different people that are connecting to them, even if we can't keep people from abusing them and using up the bandwidth. Because again, it's not that the technology is not there, it's that we've got to find ways for people that run these hotspots to have cost justification. And frankly, for many of them, they're already feeling like it's rather expensive to spend the $150 to $300 a month to provide the internet bandwidth for these people that are sitting in their space, and many of them coming in and not even buying anything, but staying in there and just using Wi-Fi. So there's always a trade-off there, and I think that we'll eventually see services that really provide great benefits. There are some that are out there now, but in my communications with many of these people that provide these hotspots in coffee shops and restaurants, they're saying right now, it's just not worth it to us. And so we're just giving access and hoping the best for people, and then just kind of watching and observing. Are there people in there that are trying to look over other people's shoulders and see passwords and things like that? And they're just doing the best that they can with what they've got. So what are some recommended practices? Well, for this webinar, we're going to summarize with really three things: update, replace, and upgrade. Update, what's that mean? Make sure your security is an RSN compliant solution. That means it's a robust security network, which is WPA2 effectively. You want strong authentication, 802.1x EAP authentication, preferably, and not a pre-shared key if you can. You want strong encryption, which means you need AES and CCNP, and then monitoring and WIPs. So this is the de facto for certainly medium and larger businesses, but even small businesses can implement many of these things today. So number one, update. Number two, replace. What are we replacing? We're replacing legacy products, like a product that'll only use WPA and will not support WPA2. So we want to eventually phase out those products and only be using those that support RSN compliant solutions, full RSN compliant solutions that are not even worried about being backwardly compatible. The last thing we want today for most of our devices is to worry about being backwardly compatible with WEP, for example. And then number three, finally, upgrade. Upgrade the firmware. So we can't just update and replace and then say, okay, good, we're done. But you're going to need to go in and update firmware periodically to make sure that you have the security patches that may be made available through that firmware. And just as a tip for you, watch for devices that are on the market now in the 802.11ac world that are literally being sold, and you're being told exactly where to go in the documentation to download the custom firmware for that device that is open source. So there's open source wireless router firmware that is available, and some devices from Asus, Linksys, and so forth are coming and they're being sold as, hey, guess what? You can get custom firmware for these. Now, why get that custom firmware? Well, the simple reason is if you're going to implement, say, an Asus 802.11ac router in a small business, instead of buying enterprise grade equipment, because maybe it really is a small business, there are only 6 or 7 employees, and they only need one access point. And so you decide to go buy this device at Best Buy. Well, rather than using the built-in firmware, which is really limited, by the way, on most of those, then go ahead and get this custom firmware. And with this custom firmware, you get enterprise class features. You're not going to get all the full centralized management functionality and things like that, but you get enterprise class features in a consumer grade device in those kinds of scenarios. So even implementing these wireless routers in small businesses, or maybe for telecommuters or something like that, today there's a way to do it with inexpensive consumer grade devices, putting more commercial grade software on them, which is very customizable. I mean, these OpenWRT, DDWRT, and so forth give you a lot of customization options that enable you to build a device that meets your customers' needs and allows you to remotely manage them easier, because you can add on scripts or modules that give you remote management functions from across the internet to more easily remotely manage them for your customers. So there are definitely some great options there, even for those consumer grade devices these days. So again, update, replace, and upgrade. Well, at this time, I just want to thank you for participating in the webinar today. And for more webinars from the past, you can check out our CWNP TV channel on YouTube. If you just search for that at YouTube, you will find it. And in the future, we have webinars coming up on building a lab for CWSP. When we talk about building a lab for CWSP, we'll actually do some demonstrations of some of the different software and hardware that you might want to have in your lab. So I'll show you what they actually look like when you're utilizing them and let you see that. And we'll have more Q&A and future webinars as well. Again, if you have questions today in relation to this webinar, feel free to visit our forum and ask questions there. And make sure that you also take a look at this webinar on YouTube after it is posted there within the next few hours. Thanks again for attending, and I hope you have a great day, and make sure you keep your wireless network secure.